1853 until 1870, Napoleon III and George Eugene Haussmann greatly renovated Paris, and it is said that during this period about 2.5 billion francs was spent, around 350,000 people were displaced, about a fifth of the roads here were built during that time, and about a fifth of the population were working on it. This is why Paris has wide open boulevards as opposed to little alleyways like in, say, Venice or Florence. And it did improve the city a great deal. It helped create a water system and sewage, and the opening of the streets helped reduce overcrowding and improved sanitation. But it still remains a quite controversial issue because the number of poor people who lost their homes is still up for debate. And it is also said that Paris was divided into rich and poor neighborhoods and lost a lot of its character, and some even argue that the renovation was only done for military purposes. After all, there were about 7 armed rebellions in Paris between 1830 and 1848, and say like in the June Rebellion, which was made famous because of Les Mis, the people formed barricades, but this was only possible in narrower streets. Plus, the wider streets allowed the army to move more freely. Anyway, as well as designing kiosks, Haussmann also designed the regular apartment blocks you see here in Paris, and they still bear his name. And he also designed a great, huge indoor market called Les Halles, which Émile Zola called the belly of Paris. However, this was destroyed in the 1970s, and Paris has lost a great deal of landmarks. For instance, you may have heard of the Elephant of the Bastille. Well, a little backstory. When the Bastille was destroyed during the French Revolution, a lot of the stones were used to make a bridge nearby. However, there was a great deal of debate as to what should be put in its place. Napoleon wanted to build a huge bronze elephant made out of bronze from enemy cannons, so very Game of Thrones style there. However, by the time he was defeated in 1815, only a plaster of the elephant had been built, and a man did guard it. In fact, he lived in its leg, but it soon began to crumble. So nobody cared for it, rats began to live in it, and in the 1840s it was taken down and the July column was put in its place. But even before the elephant was built, they had decided on building a huge statue to the Egyptian goddess Isis. Otherwise, despite numerous rebellions, revolutions, the wars of religion, that sort of thing, Paris has largely rebuilt a lot of its old buildings, albeit with the loss of a library or something like that. But the Paris Commune in 1870s was particularly destructive. You can find photos online that show just how much of the city was destroyed in 1870 and 1871, but notably they destroyed the Tuileries Palace, which was the former residence of the kings of France. However, one of the most interesting lost buildings in Paris, in my opinion, is the gibbet of Montfaucon. Now, this was a multi-storied gibbet that stood 6 meters high on top of a hill, so it was once the most prominent buildings in Paris and displayed the dead for all to see until the mid-18th century. Otherwise, the entire, let's say, shape of Paris has completely changed as well, because until the 1920s it was surrounded by huge fortifications, and until Haussmann completely redid Paris, the Seine wasn't the only river here. The river in Paris was the Bièvre, and this was a small river but was heavily polluted because a lot of tanning shops, weavers, that sort of thing, had set up on its banks and continued to just throw waste into it. And finally, Haussmann's renovations also did away with the Court of Miracles. Now, you might have heard of these if you've read or watched The Hunchback of Notre Dame, but these were slum areas where people would fake illnesses to beg and then miraculously be cured, hence the name. But Haussmann's renovations did away with the slum areas, and Henry Samuel in the 17th century said that the people living in these Courts of Miracles had their own language and stuff like that. So you lost an entire culture there.